welcome to the Passenger Seat Podcast, a podcast designed to fill your passenger seat with chat about classic cars, all recorded from my 1968 Morris Minor Peggy. I'm Becca, and today I am out doing some post-holiday errands. We got back, as you possibly saw if you follow me on Instagram, from an around 600-mile trip down to the south coast and back again yesterday, and now there's just a few bits and pieces that I need to pop out and do, collecting my spare house key from my parents, collecting some food and things because we got back last night and only had pizza in the freezer really, and we'd eaten a lot of pizza on holiday it turned out, so we need a few bits and pieces there. In reality, I should probably have taken my partner's car, which has sat on the driveway the entire time, but the real reason I took Peggy is because I really dislike driving my partner's car, and I needed to record this podcast, so it was as good an excuse as any. But I'll probably end up giving it a little run later this week, just to check it's sat happily on the drive this week. My quirk of classic car ownership does come from the holiday actually. We kind of gate crashed, as you'll see in the podcast that I'll release next week, all about what we did on our holiday in Peggy. We kind of gate crashed a local meet that was happening down there. We went to a museum, and they said, "Oh, well, you're not coming tomorrow with all the other Morris Minors." So we turned up again tomorrow to see what was going on, and there was the Hampshire and Dorset and another branch all meeting up down there, and we were kind of chatting to a few different people there, and they were talking about an article that had recently been in Minor Matters about the average mileage that classic cars do, and I think it said it was around 2,500, and these guys were a little bit surprised at that because they figured they did maybe 200 to 500 a year, if that. So I had to raise my hand and say, actually, well, it's probably me bringing up some of that average, as I've covered around 10,000 miles in my year of ownership with Peggy so far, and of course that was a lockdown year where I spent a lot of it working from home, so she really didn't get as many miles as I suspect she'll get in this year. So it's really interesting to kind of talk to people about the different ways that we use our cars, and that's a surprising thing that you find when you talk to other classic car owners, is that usage. And it's that usage that I'm actually going to talk about a little bit more detail in today's podcast. As you've probably seen from the title, thanks to many kind of shocking headlines that came out, I can now officially say I covered 200 odd miles down to the south coast in a Morris Minor on the hottest day of the year so far, as they like to say. We travelled all the way down from Cambridgeshire to the south coast, ending up in a place called Milford-on-Sea, which was where we were staying, and that came to around about 200 miles there, and then we did another 200 miles back, and approximately 150 odd while we were down and around visiting the places that we wanted to on our holiday. So she really got some pretty serious use in the last week, and when I put on my Instagram stories as we were travelling down on that Monday that we had travelled down on the hottest day of the year so far, and that we covered pretty big distances, I got a lot of people asking about how we found it, any kind of tips for doing such long trips. Thankfully, as you can see, it is a lot cooler today. I've been able to kind of do up the windows a little bit, and there is a bit of rain in the air, so I'm able to kind of quite comfortably sit in here and record this podcast. But that was definitely not the case on the way down. So I thought, in response to all of the kind of email messages and questions that I got asked on Instagram, I would do kind of a succinct one-stop place for people who are thinking about doing a longer trip in their classic or their Morris Minor, in particular, about what kind of things we did to prepare, and maybe give you some help if you're thinking of using your Morris perhaps for a holiday. So I'm going to split this podcast into kind of two sections: stuff that we had done beforehand, and then how we coped with the actual journey itself. When we were kind of prepping for the journey, I wasn't aware, I knew it was going to be hot, but I wasn't aware that it was going to be as hot as it was. I'd done a pretty long trip the year previously, about 3 weeks after I'd got my car. That was the Wales trip, and so I was under the impression that it was just going to be quite a long trip, and yes, we'd need kind of breaks and things to break up the driving a little bit for me, but it wouldn't be kind of anything much different to that. And it really was a very different experience driving in what I suspect, at least in here, was close in places, particularly down by the heater, to 35 degrees plus, really. It really was very warm in here at times. So before the trip, I had mentioned a few podcasts ago how we'd had some issues with the dynamo and also an overheating smell. And it turned out that obviously the dynamo needed replacing, but also in a very rare situation, my thermostat in the engine had actually managed to seal itself shut. And I'd noticed that smell and the hot not that long beforehand, so we'd ordered some parts when we were doing the switch over to the alternator to fit the new thermostat as well. Now, I believe Morris Minors are usually fitted with either an 84 or an 88 degree centigrade thermostat. That's certainly the ones that are sold on ESM, and I believe that's what we took out. But because before we took the thermostat out, we weren't 100% sure if that was the problem. When I was ordering the parts, they're really quite cheap, like a £5 or something, to make sure that she would run well, especially over summer. I actually looked into buying a thermostat that was for a cooler temperature. So she's now fitted with a 74 degrees centigrade thermostat. I believe it's the typical ones that you get in minis. That's certainly what the listing suggested. But it fits in, it comes with its kind of generic little cork gasket, and I don't know massively how much of a difference it's made, but it's quite reassuring to me to know that not only is it now opening up, which is going to open up at a lower temperature and try and keep that engine cooler, especially on those longer runs. So that's something that we had to do anyway, given what had happened to the old thermostat. We had to make the change, but it wasn't too difficult of a change. So if you're worried, it might be something you want to think about fitting and having a look into yourself. Alternatively, something that I would definitely recommend if you're going to do a long trip regardless of temperature is use the car on shorter, more local runs for maybe a week or two beforehand. Obviously Peggy, being my daily, is used pretty regularly, and it means that the problems don't necessarily crop up when you're going to a show or whatever. Obviously with the hot rod show that was the case, but it gives the problems that might be sitting otherwise to crop up before you're 300, 400 miles into a trip, or whatever it is. So I used her obviously for a few shows and things beforehand. Some of those trips were a little bit longer, but even my little runs to and from work in the few weeks before the holiday were all going to make sure that anything that I noticed as an issue, for example the door popping open, even little things like the glove box kept popping open, so things that I knew were going to annoy me on a longer trip, I was able to kind of find some options for fixing those issues before the trip. And if I had had the car kind of sat in a garage for maybe the 3 weeks beforehand, I wouldn't have had those opportunities to spot those things. Obviously, your oil and water are your big checks, but literally on the day before you go, but also kind of leading into, I guess, the next part, check them pretty regularly throughout your trip. Any kind of stops or whatever you do look into making sure that you're pretty happy with those levels. And of course, the age-old problem with Morris Minors, make sure you've greased your trunnions and things like that pretty recently before your trip, again to make sure that you're kind of eliminating any of those common problems and you're pretty comfortable with everything that is likely to go wrong. So I actually got Peggy about 2 or 3 days before last year's really big heat wave, and I can remember pretty distinctly offering to go and pick my mum up from work to give her a ride in my new car, and it being very, very hot and being very unprepared for how hot it was going to be in here with the vinyl seats. And I had a pretty gross moment when I got out and realised that it was pretty sweaty. And so my mum quickly said that bring towels for the seats. It wasn't something that I had previously kind of thought of, but it was something that my parents, having driven kind of older cars and been around for when vinyl seats were very much the norm, they were quite used to having to do. And being my daily car, I thought, well, maybe we need a little bit of a more permanent solution. So depends on your situation. Taking towels, beach towels or something to put over your seats is always a good option. But I actually went on the Shop Disney website and ordered myself up some beach towels with Captain America's kind of chest design all over them, and got my sister to run me up just kind of a slip cover, so it folds over the top, it's sewn up each side on the sewing machine, and then got a bit of elastic that goes underneath the bottom of the chair, and that works pretty effectively at kind of reducing some of the hot and sweat from the seats, and they're pretty easy for putting them in the washing machine or things like that. There's more expensive fixes like getting like actual leather seats for your car, or finding some kind of period covers. I did meet a gentleman at the branch meeting who actually had period kind of tartan material seats in his Morris Minor. But for me, these towels work great. They also cover up the fact that it's her original seats in here. So there's a few kind of really bodge fixes that by having these themed beach towels in here nicely covers up for me, really. So that's kind of all of the things that I did in preparation beforehand. Some of these things I've obviously had in the car for a while, but they certainly made the journey more. And Peggy certainly didn't seem to have any real problems with like overheating, struggling with how hot it was. None of those sorts of things really were her. It was mostly us that was getting hot, and there was a few things that we kind of came across whilst driving that we found kind of helped. So when we set off on the day, I knew it was going to be hot. I'd kind of seen the weather forecast a few days before, I knew it was going to be hot, so I made sure that I was wearing kind of really light cotton clothes, but also that my hair was tied up. There's nothing worse as a female driver, at least in my opinion, than being really hot in your car and having like hot hair on the back of your neck. So I found a style that I was pretty happy to have it kind of tied up in whilst I was driving, but also was really secure because those windows were going to be open the entire way. Doing 60-70 on the motorway, those windows were open and there was not much else I wanted to be worrying about. I certainly didn't want like my hair and things floating around my face. We did have the windows open pretty much all the way down there, just to try and help get some airflow in here. It's the most obvious thing, but accepting that you are going to have those windows all the way down, all the way there, and being prepared for the noise, because obviously lots of cars going past you, especially if you're going motorways, is going to be quite loud and noisy. Certainly not ideal podcast recording situations. I also found that when I was getting quite warm and hot, having something to distract me, not from driving as such, but something else to think about. So if I was having a conversation with Jamie, that worked quite well. But when there wasn't much to talk about, it was good to have music on, or maybe a podcast or something else to kind of think about, so that you're not just sat there thinking, it's hot, I'm so hot, it's so warm, I can't believe it's this hot. All these sorts of things are going to feel cooler. The other super important thing for you on a hot, long journey in a classic car is making plans for stops. Don't just go, okay, we'll stop when I need to, and stop off at service stations. Make plans for something that's going to be nice and enjoyable for you, and is going to kind of be something you're willing to stop for longer for. So on the way down, we parked up in Oxford. Being a Morris minor, it was a really great opportunity for me to take her to Oxford. I'd never been before, at least that I can remember. Maybe as a very small child I went as part of a car show, but I couldn't remember having been before. And so we parked up in Oxford. Admittedly, we parked in a multi-storey, not for everyone, but it was an air-conditioned multi-storey, so Peggy was very cool to come back to. And we could have a little walk around Oxford, have a kind of look at the sights, say we've been there kind of thing, get some food, and we spent maybe a couple of hours in Oxford enjoying it and taking advantage of some air-conditioned shops and things like that. And it didn't feel like we were making the journey longer by stopping, which can be kind of one of the reasons some people don't feel like stopping, because they just want to get the journey over with. It was kind of a part of our adventure, really. We did stop at some service stations as well on the way down, just to kind of pull over, get some air, get some really cold drinks from the service station, and also just to wind down the windows, have a sit under some shade in some trees, and just kind of sit, watch her cool off a little bit, but mostly just to get some air and cool off ourselves and hydrate kind of thing. It's a good opportunity at that sort of thing to obviously check your oil and water as well, in case you're worried about your car boiling over and things like that. But it was mostly us boiling over, to be quite honest with you. If you are going to leave your car for a long time and you don't have the kind of option to put it in a nice air-conditioned multi-storey like us, then you've obviously got the option to perhaps get some kind of windscreen blocker just to stop the air getting into the car and carrying on, heating it up while you're not in it, because there's nothing worse than getting into a really hot car when you get back. So I saw a few people had kind of put blankets and things over the front of their cars, took them in the doors and then closed the doors. Anything like that might work well for you. I've seen people using compasses and things online to work out where the sun is going to be at certain times in the day, so that you can park where it's going to be shady towards the time that you'll come back. All these things are pretty nifty tips and tricks that you can look into. But for us, when we were just parking up at the service stations, it was just nice for us to go and get in the shade and just leave her windows and everything open and just let some breeze come through and cool off. So that's kind of all of the things that we did. It's probably worth noting that Peggy has got a few modifications that maybe made the journey a little easier. She is my first and only Morris Minor that I've driven, really, especially for such distances. So I don't know how much of a difference the thermostat's made. I don't know how much of a difference my 5-speed gearbox has made, or my supposed racing manifold. All these things are kind of there. They're probably designed to make those sorts of journeys a little bit more bearable and easy. But I don't think that if you haven't got these things, that if you want to take your car for a really long journey, you should be put off. Just be prepared. Plan those exciting stops and things on your journey. Make it an adventure. There's loads of wonderful places that you can kind of stop off and enjoy now. So make the most of them, and I hope that today's episode has answered a few of your questions about taking a car of Peggy's age or younger or older out in such heat, and you're perhaps plotting a adventure yourself. I'm going to go into a few more details in next week's podcast about kind of the ins and outs of what we did while we were down there, and a few more kind of details about the things that we did on our stops and things like that. So look out for that one, and happy 10th podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Happy motoring and drive safely.